All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for the third and final Summer of NativeScript get-together here. I am joined again by my colleague Clark Sell.
Hello.
And today we will be diving deep. Now, first of all, this is the third in a series of three videos that we're doing here. So if you're finding this first, you might want to go back, do a search for Summer of NativeScript on YouTube. Go to nativescript.org/summer to find the first two videos. But just to quickly recap, we talked about what NativeScript was, what it is, how to build apps with it, how to use UI controls, modules, app logic, navigation, some of the basics. But today we're moving beyond that. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite features is accessing native code or native iOS and Android APIs. We'll be talking about debugging, the various things you can do to debug your NativeScript apps, and NPM modules and NativeScript plugins, which are sort of tied together, and we'll be talking about that.
So since this is our third one, we've covered 3 months, it's probably also important to mention that we've had a few updates in NativeScript since. So if people haven't been paying attention, make sure you go update things.
Yep, 1.2 came out 2 weeks ago. I don't know. I've lost track of time, but number of cool updates, and we'll be talking about several of those actually today.
Cool.
And the very first thing we have on our list is accessing native code. And we talked about this before, but probably the NativeScript's defining feature is that you have complete access to absolutely everything that iOS and Android can do. All the APIs are just sitting around in your JavaScript files, and you can use them. And I think the real power here comes that it just sort of enables you to do really anything, because even though NativeScript has a lot of cross-platform abstractions, there's a lot of modules, a lot of built-in functionality. In most apps, at some point, you're going to need to step off the rails a little bit. You're going to need to get into a very specific circumstance, some APIs that you need. And the great thing with NativeScript is that you always have a way out. You always have a way to get at these APIs.
Yeah, I agree.
And so the specifics can be a little strange, and I want to get into that today. And I'm going to use a specific example that I actually built a couple months ago now. I needed a flashlight as part of my app, just silly little thing I was building, and I wanted to use the flashlight. And there's no NativeScript module. If you go to the NativeScript docs and you search for flashlight, there's no sort of pre-baked flashlight module that's built into the framework itself. So what I did is I did what any developer would do is I went to Google and asked Google, well, how do I turn the flashlight on? And Google, as it does, sent me to Stack Overflow, where I found just some random person gave this very helpful Objective-C chunk of code here. And this is a toggle function. This is a method that you would call to toggle the flashlight in an iOS app written in Objective-C. So the question here, and it took me a while, is then, well, how do I actually do this in NativeScript? Like, this is Objective-C code.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I know, Clark, you've tried doing this too. And I mean, at least what worked for me at first was a bit of trial and error, especially in Objective-C. Like the one tricky thing here is that this sort of bracket syntax here, which is actually a method invocation in Objective-C, which is the most curious and strange syntax I think I've seen in any language for doing that.
Yeah.
But like things like device has torch here, this is actually what you'd think of in a more traditional C-like language as like device.has torch with the open and closed parentheses.
Yeah.
And the code here to actually show how this works in NativeScript, this is basically just a complete port of the code from the previous slide. And you get to see things like some of these things just turn directly into method calls. The property accesses, this device.torch mode, this is actually equivalent to this set torch mode call here. NativeScript just gives you a little shorthand that you can set a property and it'll automatically take care of calling the appropriate setter under the hood.
Yeah, so
But
I think to your point here, that we're not hiding anything from you. There is a bit of kind of transforming from one language to the next, right? Because we've got Objective C in this case on one side, although you could be reading Swift as well. And then you're going to have to make those calls in JavaScript. So you still do need to know kind of what you're working with, because you are in fact calling those APIs.
yep. Yeah, it's the same thing. And what's cool about that is when you do search for these things, oftentimes you do find results. Like you end up on either a place like Stack Overflow, a place like just even the iOS and Android docs, find a snippet of code there and transform it back and forth. And actually, Objective-C, I mean, I came into this knowing zero Objective-C. I had never touched it before, had no idea what I was doing. And after just playing with it for several hours, trying to get down some of the basic syntax things, I was able to sort of do some quick porting back and forth. Nothing too complex, but just get the basics running back and forth.
Yeah.
But I found Android and Java to be considerably easier. And so to show this, I ran, of course, the same search, just looking for a Java Android example. And Java, at least syntactically, is more similar to JavaScript than at least Objective-C is. So you see the familiar syntax for calling methods. A little more straightforward, and you could see that too in the actual code that happens in NativeScript. It looks pretty much exactly like the Java code. The only real difference is that you see the packages actually spelled out here. Java has import statements. So Java, what you're not seeing in these snippets here is somewhere there's import java.whatever.camera, and in NativeScript you have to spell all those things out instead of including the import statements. But that's mostly it in terms of the actual conversion there.
Yeah.
And I had a few other tips for trying these things out. So there is documentation on the NativeScript docs. I have some links here that'll walk you through some of the more nuanced things that are beyond simple method calls or property accesses, which tend to be fairly straightforward, because you can literally do anything. So you can even do things like extend native Java objects, native Objective-C objects. There are syntaxes available for doing that sort of thing, but it gets a little bit beyond the basics that we're able to cover here. And I know one thing that has helped me a lot is that NativeScript actually publishes these TypeScript definition files that you can use as a reference for the native APIs. Now, these definition files are primarily intended for people using NativeScript with TypeScript. And so if that is you, if you like to use TypeScript, you get some really cool code complete for these native APIs. So you can type NS, and NativeScript or TypeScript will tell you, oh, here are all the NS things that you can do. The same thing with UI. You could type Java dot, etc. But even if you're not using TypeScript, which Clark and I aren't
we're not TypeScript people, but these two files, for me, this is where it all kind of came home, because I know back in our early days of this, I struggled a bit with, some of the APIs are a little bit different in the translation when it creates the metadata, or at least a little different than what they look like from the source. And so we look at this and you go, all right, well, I know I need to pass a parameter, an array in here, or whatever the input is. And for me, this kind of brought the whole thing home, from getting from JavaScript to the native libraries.
Yeah, and as an example, like as you can see, if you look at my scroll bar, you can get a sense of the epicness of this, because I mean, this is all of iOS in here, and the same thing for all of Android. So the search is your friend here. So for instance, we looked at hasTorch just a minute ago. So you could see that hasTorch is a method of AV capture device, which is an NS object, and it returns a Boolean. But you could also see, like, if you're interested in hasTorch, you could also look around and say, oh, look, there's a torch level that returns a number, and all of these other things that you can do with it. And I actually find this a lot easier to browse than the iOS docs, and sort of the same thing with Android, just because, or at least have them up simultaneously, just because it's a little easier, because this is putting things in sort of the JavaScript basis that NativeScript is using.
Yeah. So I know we've talked about it before in the past, but as a reminder, like, how do we get to this point? I mean, what's NativeScript doing? How is NativeScript making this possible? So what if I want to bring another library into this? These TypeScript files aren't going to know anything about that.
Yep. So the NativeScript generates this. It has this process known as basically a metadata generation process, and it has a way of injecting APIs into the JavaScript VMs that NativeScript sort of uses to run your actual application. So NativeScript will look at the full-on iOS SDKs, the full-on Android SDKs to actually generate this big list that gets generated in here. Now, to the point of, well, what if you have a third-party framework? You're right, they will not appear in this list. If you wanted to use the Google Maps or the Google Play Services SDK, Google Maps SDK on iOS, you won't find them in this list. Where that comes in is you could access those APIs through a NativeScript plugin, which we'll be talking about momentarily. But what the plugin will do is it'll create the same sort of syntax for your SDK. Basically, the metadata processor generator just runs against those SDKs that the plugin uses so that you can use them, but you won't be able to sort of search for them in these files.
So this is a compilation time generation that happens, right?
Yeah. NativeScript just sort of spits this out as it does its metadata thing. And as I said, primarily for the NativeScript modules are written in TypeScript. And so if you're working on the NativeScript modules, like if you want to contribute a patch to the NativeScript modules, they're written in TypeScript. And what's cool about TypeScript is that you actually get, at the compile time, you get warnings if you're using incorrect types, those other things. And those are all driven by this definition file here.
Sure. Now, and this is the same. So since this happens every time at compilation, today, I think just, half hour, an hour ago, Apple announced, the next iOS event that's coming here in a week or so's time. So when the final bits come for iOS 9, I'm going to get that on my machine. I don't have to do anything with NativeScript, right? I don't have to wait for Telerik to pump me another NativeScript. I just need to recompile my thing, and it's going to take the latest SDK. Am I saying that correct? Is that a fallacy, or is that correct?
Yeah, more or less. The actual runtime will change. The NativeScript runtime will have an update to point at the native SDK. So these things, you're correct that they just basically get automatically generated, and these come from the actual module repo. So if I go to github.com/this, and if I spell it correctly, which I totally didn't do there, github.com/NativeScript, these TypeScript definition files are hanging out in here. And somewhere in here, and I don't know the exact things, but it'll have the SDK that's being used to generate these. But you could absolutely say, like, we have iOS 9, we have Android M running internally already. It's basically just as simple as pointing yourself at a new SDK that you want to use to generate these files.
That's cool. So day zero is a legit day zero support.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's just cool. Where you have to have you have to have the SDK on your machine because you have to have something to point the metadata at to build it, and that's about it. Yeah. So
it's cool. It's very cool. And getting over that kind of power of any API, any SDK that you can just call us in JavaScript is crazy. And I know you said you look a lot at those metadata packages, as do I, but I also look a lot at the modules that have been written and how they do things like interact with the camera and how they've extended the camera, because there's some good patterns in those TNS modules as well.
Yep, and those files are just plain text in your project, so they're a pretty good reference when you run into how NativeScript itself has solved some of these problems. So it's sort of dog foods upon the same system you can use.
Yeah.
The last thing I have in here is you can actually, with some of the debug tooling that we'll be showing momentarily, get some autocomplete within the debug tooling as well, which can be a kind of fun way to play with these APIs as well, but we'll get into that momentarily. So we're going to talk about debugging, but first I wanted to show a quick example of this. Let me get out of this. some of these native API accesses. Now, we've been using the Just Meme app that the Clark and I built to sort of show off some of these examples. And I'm going to bring it over here. And one of the new NativeScript 1.2 features that I've added in here is the action bar UI element. And the action bar UI element controls this little, I'll bring it up here, the little nav bar that appears on the top of the screen, both for iOS and Android. And if I type this correctly, it'll come up here in a second. Now, just to give you an idea of what this sort of native API access can do, I'll show a little bit of code that you can use to sort of tweak the action bar. So we'll give it a second to launch there. So the action bar, what you're seeing here, action bar title just meme, it actually applies right here. This is what you're seeing being created. So I'm going to take a little bit of code that's pre-written here, head into my load function and paste this in. And all this code is doing is saying, am I iOS? Because we don't want to execute this code on Android. It's cross-platform project here. And then just getting access to some of these APIs and doing things with them. So kill the sidebar here. Get access to a navigation item, which is going to be a UI navigation controller, iOS control, and then calling some of its APIs, as we saw earlier. It has a bar tint color, so this will call the set bar tint color, bar style, tint color, that sort of thing. And I can actually just port this over to this app. Now, one other thing I want to show is another thing that's new in NativeScript 1.2 is the live sync command. So instead of, say, saving this file and heading back over here and needing to run TNS run again and taking a few seconds to launch, one of the things I can do is I can say I want to live sync iOS. I'm going to be using an emulator. And I'm also going to pass the watch flag because I want live sync to actually watch my changes as they happen here. So it takes about 2 or 3 seconds to set up the watcher. There we go. And assuming I didn't fat finger something here, should be able to save. And you can see that takes about a second or two to throw out there. And now, because of this code here, these RGB values are actually making this bar look green.
That's my head just went.
And you can verify it's green. So let me. So live sync is pretty cool because you could just go mess with some things here.
You could just trial and error your RGB values away.
Yeah, because let's see, I think that should be red, right? Yeah, there we go. And I think this is text color, UI color. I think we could do that. I don't know. Apparently that just affects buttons, but.
Well, and you also notice above we killed the back button.
Oh yeah, I don't know how we did that, but.
No, line 24.
Line 24.
Sets hides back button animated.
Oh, okay. Oh, pretty cool. But hopefully you can see just the power of the two things sort of bring this together. So you have live sync, which lets me sort of play with this. I wonder what bar style is. Bar style 1? I don't know what that did. Did that just change the status bar?
I don't know.
I think it changed the color of the status bar. I don't know.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I can play with native APIs. I mean, this is a lot faster than even if you were just developing a native iOS app and you wanted to iterate on that. Just working this way is actually significantly faster than even that. And you could do the same thing on Android as well. The same command works if you had an Android emulator up also.
Yeah, and I think it's probably also important to bring up that while here in a page load we're showing, if iOS do X, and then it's only natural to think if Android do Y. If you find yourself in these common scenarios where you're doing that, go make a module out of it so that you can reuse it better and not kind of litter your code with the pound if blocks, if you will.
Yep.
In this case, right, this is what made sense for just meme. It wasn't. It was an edge case, not a common thing.
Yeah, and iOS is smart enough that once you set these sort of navigation bar things here, it'll respect it throughout the app. So we can go navigate around in here, and it'll keep those styles. So pretty cool. We will talk about that a little bit more throughout this session, but I want to move on to debugging. And let me find my button here, because there's also some big improvements to debugging with NativeScript 1.2 as well. Now, there's some things that we've kind of already talked about that I just want to briefly go over that you can do with NativeScript. The NativeScript CLI automatically logs any console statements that you make in your app to the terminal. So if you launch your app for development and you have console.log statements, we use a bunch of them in Just Meme for just trivial like tracing to error logging, that sort of thing. Those things will be sent to the terminal automatically, just so it's easier for you to debug what's going on. And the other thing that the NativeScript does is also sends, that's just an example of the logging from the terminal here. The other thing it does is also sends stack traces to your terminal as well. So if you screw something up, you can head back to your terminal to see what went wrong. So we've kind of discussed that before, and there's the example of things going wrong with the non-existent method. But the one thing that is new is NativeScript 1.2 now actually has a dedicated web inspector for iOS, and it has a bit of debug tooling for Android as well. Now, you kick this off with the TNS debug command, which we've had around for a while, but we've really polished it up to make it pretty powerful. It has things like step debugging and interactive console that'll give you things like autocomplete, step debugging, various different things. And we're really working on expanding it. So you'll see things like the debugging of the visual tree, like kind of like you're used to seeing elements in an HTML page that you're debugging. Having that sort of thing available for your NativeScript apps, that's on the way. And also performance benchmarking as well. If you want to see how many FPS your app is getting or what sort of memory is being used. Those are the things that we're sort of working on right now that should be coming fairly soon to the CLI. And so we want to show this off and show off some of these things you can do. So Clark, I'm going to toss things back over to you for a demo of this one.
Let's do it. We're going to break the internet.
Yeah, I think we have to figure out how to switch screen sharings, which... Oh yeah, that was pretty seamless.
It's the internet. All right, so same thing, right? I'm basically replicating what you had. We have Just Meme and, in this case, Atom. Here's our home JS file. I've already warmed up the simulator, so or the emulator. It's sitting there running. Let's come over here, and we're just going to kill the terminal. I'm going to run TNS debug iOS. If you see down here in the terminal, kick it off in the emulator. And in this case, I'm setting the device so it's not the iPhone 5 or whatever the really tiny one is. So if I run that, take a second here to...
yeah, and there's two different modes that you can kick off the debug command with. There's --start, which will actually launch it on an already running app. And then there's debug break, which will set a breakpoint right at the beginning of the app.
Yeah, so here we are side by side. You can see the terminal. I'm going to try to make these 3 windows. And I realize that the screen's a little small, but I want you to see some of the statements come across. So here's our terminal. Not really worth reading. Here's the debug console. Here's the console itself in there, as we were mentioning, and you can see some items have already been logged through. And if I come through and I click on one of these guys, you'll see that the terminal got one, and we got a home unloaded event fired. If I come back, I got some more stuff coming through. So you can see some of the parity of the things that we already touched on.
Yeah, it's a little nicer to view in the web inspector, a little easier to filter through the noise.
Yeah, so we'll just ignore the terminal for the moment. So I'm running on the left. And let's come over to the resources. And here's everything that's loaded at the moment. And so kind of nice. The template view here, if I want to go create a new meme template, is under views app. I'm just going to filter out some of this stuff because what you see right now is our TNS modules that were loaded, any of the views that we've created. So let's go app and then let's go views. So now you can see we've got 4 of our own just because you and I put them in the views folder, the splash screen, the home, the create meme. So I don't have the template one yet. But if I come over here and I hit template, you'll see that it popped into view. I cancel and go back. It still happens to be there at the moment until the time that it gets unloaded. So if I come over here, let's just pick like navigated to, which is somewhere up here at the top.
26. Yeah.
So I put a breakpoint as you would expect. Come over into debugger. You can see I have the breakpoint here, whatever exceptions. If I hit new template, I broke into my function, and then I can step through and do the things as you would expect. I just stepped over that guy. I'm out. It's running. Let's see. Let's do there we go.
Yeah, and you get to see, like, if you look in the right column there, the variables that are within scope and their values.
Yep.
Just as you'd expect from a JavaScript debugger that you'd use on the web.
Exactly. But very, very helpful. And I come over here and I could type UI. You can see I get some autocomplete, and these happen to be the native APIs. So as you would expect, nothing console.log.
Yeah, and I actually spent some time playing with this too. Because I think it's a pretty fun way to learn how some of these native APIs work, because it gets annoying to be in a JavaScript file and trying to see, like, well, does this want a string? Does this want a number? How does this work? And you could just launch the debug tools and just try these things on the fly, rather than going through the refresh cycle. Even with something like live sync, this is a bit faster.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, it's now question. I haven't tried this, but you should be able to live sync and debug into the same one, right?
I'm not sure, actually. If not, we need to request to make that happen.
Let's. Do I just need to say add live sync, or is it a parameter?
It's TNS live sync iOS. Get rid of debug. -- emulator. Yep, that should do it. -- watch if you want to add the watcher.
But now I've lost debug, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's do. No idea.
Let's make up syntax and see if it works.
That doesn't work.
I know there's plans on. I mean, the web inspector is still fairly new as we're adding functionality to it, and I know there's plans to make the workflow a little more seamless. I'm not sure exactly how the two things coexist. It looks like you hit a breakpoint there.
Is it in there?
Yeah, it looks like line 30, 35 you got stuck on. So definitely worth taking some time to experiment with.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else?
I was just going to ask, anything else you want to show on here? I mean, I feel bad. It's like, it's what you would expect, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's it. It's something I think everybody should take a little bit of time, especially once you start to get into some non-trivial NativeScript stuff. It can really be a lifesaver.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. You have to stop sharing your screen before I can take it over for you. There we go. We can go back to the slides. Share screen.
I gotcha.
All right. And the third thing we have to talk about is NPM modules. Now, if you're not familiar with NPM modules, they're basically just JavaScript modules. They're the same modules that Node modules use. So if you've done any Node.js stuff, NativeScript modules and NPM modules adhere to what's known as the CommonJS spec. And really, the CommonJS spec is fairly simple. It more or less just defines two things. There's a require keyword, which is how you bring in other modules that you want to use in your module, and the export and exports keywords, which are just ways of exporting what your module does so that they can be consumed by other modules. So one command to bring in modules and one command to sort of export things to others. But the cool thing is that as of the latest version of NativeScript, you can install modules and use them in your NativeScript apps basically exactly like you would do in a Node.js app. So I have a very practical example that I like to use for this, just because it has the simplest API imaginable. And someone thank goodness, took the time to write a knock knock jokes npm module. But I use this as an example, just like I said, a simple API. Each of these modules has its installation command built right on the npm site. So if you go to npmjs.com and just do a search for really any package you're interested in, just head to this section here and look for how you have to install it. And that exact same command is available for NativeScript apps as well. You'll probably want to include the -- save flag, because that's what tells NativeScript to actually, or what tells npm more specifically, to save that dependency. So to remember that you are dependent on the knock knock jokes module, or whatever the case may be. Now, in terms of NativeScript apps, you'll want to run that install in the root of your app. So the same folder that's going to have your app folder and your platforms folder and your package.json file within it. The actual save flag will tell npm to save that dependency in the package.json file, and it's the same file that npm and Node modules use to save dependencies for Node apps. NativeScript uses it as well. What the NativeScript CLI actually does is it takes the files from your Node modules folder that you've installed as dependencies and sort of injects them into the appropriate place in your app so that you can use them using the same syntax that you'll find documented on the module's npm site. And so what that'll look like is, for the knock knock jokes module, you just require it and use it. And that's really just about all there is to it. And I'll show an example in our live app here momentarily. But even more practical examples, I know one that I've used several times already is moment.js, just a really convenient date and time parser for JavaScript. It's, again, just as simple as installing it with npm install and then just using it. I have a really basic example there where I just format today's date. So I'll show an example here before we get into which modules work and which ones don't, because the Just Meme app actually uses a few different npm modules. So if I go into my package.json root level here, you can see that right now Just Meme depends on Lodash and marked. And the Lodash one, I think, is probably the more common one that people are going to want to use. And so I'll show where this is actually used in this app. So Just Meme has this little screen here where you create and configure a meme. You can go crazy like this. And one problem we had while we were developing this is we have a little watcher here that says, when any of these things change, go ahead and redraw the image. Well, the problem was it was just redrawing an absolutely enormous number of images, like multiple times per millisecond. And it was causing all sorts of memory issues and all sorts of other things. And Lodash actually has, if I open it up here, a function called debounce, which basically all it says is run this function, but make sure it doesn't run any more than every 10 milliseconds, just to keep spamming requests out to whatever it is you're trying to do. In this case, it's refreshing the image or just redrawing the image, redrawing this text on this image, which helped solve some of our memory issues. I think we have LiveSync still running, so it's a little bit easier to see if I kick this way up. If I say, instead of every 10 milliseconds, redraw it every second. And now you can see as I do things, the image actually isn't redrawn more than every 1 second. 10 seemed to be sufficient to sort of get around our performance problems, so we just went with that. But in terms of how this actually works, you can see that it's pretty simple. I mean, once it's installed, so it'll just be npm install lodash -- save. All you have to do is just require the thing. So I'm requiring underscore here equals lodash, and then just actually using it here, and that's really it. It's really all there is to it.
Yeah, it's nice. It was kind of painful in the beginning, but it is nice now.
And I know, what other npm modules? I mean, we've used. I know we've used moments. Some people like underscore. I've used an email validator little app, and one thing I was doing just because I didn't want to write that myself.
Well, and in this case, the other one we use is marked, where we're doing markdown to HTML.
Yeah, I should get that up.
That's a nice little thing that I need to get packaged up and out on NPM as well.
Yeah, so marked, let me do a find here so I can see where it's used. Yeah, in your case, you were just turning Markdown into HTML, right?
Yep.
Which, again, like instead of writing that ourselves, you just brought this in and then boom.
Yeah.
That's all there is to it.
Yeah, I gotta love it.
So I'm going to show one more of these, but I'm going to do it as a NativeScript plugin, and I'll explain what I mean here. We'll go back to the slides here. So one question we get asked a lot is, well, can you use all NPM modules? And there are some caveats to it's not like you can go to NPM and just use absolutely anything you see out there, because there are some modules that have dependencies that NativeScript just can't work with. I mean, the biggest one is the browser. So if you have a module that depends on the DOM or looking at doing some HTML thing, those modules aren't going to work in NativeScript. NativeScript has no DOM. So those sort of things aren't going to work. The other one that comes up a lot are ones that are dependent on some Node.js APIs that NativeScript doesn't support. And some of those too, we're working on supporting as many of those common APIs as we can, because those are the sort of things that can be polyfilled in NativeScript in some circumstances, but you'll find that a lot of those don't work today. And I think, do you have anything else you wanted to add about NPM modules before you move into plugins?
No, I mean, search there first, and if I guess I would challenge everybody who's in this is to, like I need to get off my rear and get the marked one, get that whole release notes thing done. I mean, if you come across scenarios, build one, put it out on NPM, and share with everybody.
Yep. And with that, we'll segue into sort of the last thing we're going to talk about today, and that's NativeScript plugins. And I've talked about how these are sort of similar to NPM modules, and it's because NativeScript plugins are also NPM modules. You'll find NativeScript plugins, they live on NPM, they're registered on the NPM registry. But NativeScript plugins have sort of the extra added ability to run native code, use sort of the syntax we saw earlier, as well as leverage native iOS and Android SDKs. So a plugin can say, I want to use the Google Maps SDK and offer a map UI component or an XML component, for instance. It can also do things like help manage permissions and such. And I have a few examples in here momentarily. But the syntax, I talked about how they're similar to NPM modules. The one thing different is the actual installation process, because there's actually a separate command for installing plugins that's different than just NPM install. And the reason this different command is needed is because the plugin add command sort of does the extra processing needed to set up these things, like these native SDKs. Like if the case that your plugin has a native SDK it depends on, this command will take care of actually installing that in your project. If there's permission changes or configuration changes, it'll handle that as well. But under the hood, it is actually just doing the same basic process that NPM install does. So, yep, I just spelled out what I have. Installs from NPM, deals with configuration files and actual SDKs. Now, to give you an example of this, I talked about the flashlight module that I worked on earlier, and I actually wrapped this up into a NativeScript plugin. So you can go out to NPM and search for NativeScript flashlight, and you'll find this plugin. And one of the cool things that plugins let me do is that I can actually take care of permissions directly within the plugin. So on Android, you need permissions to access the camera, which a flashlight plugin needs. But through a plugin, I can provide a little snippet that just automatically takes care of the permissions. That way, someone that wants to use the plugin doesn't have to go into their Android manifest and deal with permissions and get into that mess that's way more confusing than it should be. They can just TNS plugin add flashlight plugin and be on their way. The other one that's a little more complex is the very recently added NativeScript push plugin, which lets you do handle push notifications in your NativeScript app. If you look at this, and it's up on GitHub, so github.com/nativescript/push-plugin, you'll see things like on iOS, it leverages a few different framework files. I am actually not sure of the nitty-gritty details of all of how this is installed. But it uses different frameworks. And on Android, it has a jar that it brings in it as part of the actual implementation. But the thing is, as a user of this plugin, you are shielded from all of that. Really, all you have to care about is I run TNS plugin add. I find this thing's JavaScript API. I use it, and that's really all there is to it. I think I have a couple more examples up here. So here's the basic installations, but I'm actually going to switch back over to the code to actually show this in action. So unlike the NPM module, I'm actually going to install one here. And I want to install the social share, which is quite the alliteration challenge module. So what I'm going to do, TNS plugin add, NativeScript social share, and add this to the app. Now, I talked earlier about how this command is basically just doing an npm install. So if I go to my root here, I'll see that my package.json now includes NativeScript social share as a dependency of this.
Now, you didn't have to type save, though, right?
I did not. That is one difference. The save is automatic with TNS plugin add. So I don't have to actually spell it out.
Okay.
And in my node modules, NativeScript social share is sitting here alongside some of these other modules that were installed earlier. And then to use it, so what I'm going to do to give some context here is I'll bring the app back up here. And I want a little share icon up here in the nav bar. And that's what I'm going to try to accomplish here. So the first thing I'm going to do, we looked at the action bar earlier, and this page is the create meme page. So right now the action bar is very simple. It's just basically throwing a title up there. I'm going to replace that with one that's a little bit more complex and has these action items, or more or less buttons that show up here. And I want an action item that's just going to say share. It's going to call a share method that I'm going to define in here. I'll save that.
You're not running live sync anymore either.
I am not. Yep. So I will get to that. I have to bring in the social share, the module that's within this plugin. You'll see the syntax is still nice and easy. All I have to do is require the thing. I don't have to give some complex path to where this plugin is. It's just available top level. And actually, just for a little backstory, the way that's determined is if I go into the node modules implementation of this, NativeScript will actually look at the package.json, and whatever you configure as the main file here is what it's going to load by default. So social share.js will correspond to these files here. And that's how NativeScript knows that when you just type the folder name here to actually go get that file. It'll look at what your main is. And there was a share function, so I'm going to have to paste that in here. And from there, I should be able to run it. It'll just work. Now, you talked about live sync earlier. This is one thing. Live sync will pick up on your changes and actually deploy them out, but live sync can't actually handle everything. Like there are certain file changes that you make that you actually have to go through a build again. And plugins are one of those things because it's actually changing native code. So it's not something that can be interpreted on the fly.
Yeah.
Other things would be like your app's icons, your app's manifest files. Those are things that you just have to go through a build. But once you've went through that build, once that build is actually put out, you can start your live sync back up again and then start making your JavaScript, CSS, XML changes and just get on your way.
So basically, if you got to change the visual tree, any JavaScript or CSS, you get it in live sync. Any kind of structural changes or assets added to it, you need to rebuild. Yeah.
Actually, let me show that. So I have the share button here, which will let me share this very awesome meme here. And you can see it brings up the native iOS sharing widget here. And if I go back to the terminal and I fire up live sync again, actually, I think I have it in my history. So now that I've actually deployed this plugin out here, when the watcher starts, and there it goes, I can go back and make changes to my app. So, okay, if I can manage to type here. So if I have share, if I get really excited about my desire to share here, and look at that. You can see that the live sync will take care of it.
You're very excited about that.
I am very excited about that. The other thing I'll show too is the way this actually works under the hood, because I think it's fun, is the NativeScript CLI will actually copy these NPM modules and plugins into your native app. And so if you dig down deep enough in your platforms folder, you'll find where these things actually end up. So the syntax we saw over here, how you could just type things like unqualified. There's no paths here. And that's because the required command in NativeScript looks at this TNS modules directory if you just don't provide any leading dot, leading slash, that sort of thing. And you'll see that all the NPM modules are just hanging out in here. There's Lodash, there's Marked, there's NativeScript Social Share. The CLI also handles renaming those .ios and .android files by the time they end up in the native app. So what was socialshare.ios.js is now just in here as socialshare.js. And these files are, again, pretty easy to read. You could actually fire up the debug tools that we saw earlier. If you ran into an issue with this sharing file, you could step in here and debug it. You could start playing with some of the code. You see this, it's just kind of fun because all of these things sort of dog food off of each other. And this code doesn't look very dissimilar to what we were just looking at a few minutes ago earlier.
Now, what module was this?
NativeScript Social Share.
It's funny.
Fun times.
Say that 5 times fast on a Friday.
Exactly. But this is another good example, I think, of just what the power of being able to access these native APIs gets you. Because even if you have no idea what this code does, and I have no idea what this code does here, what's cool is that even in these few lines of code, you're able to wrap this up with a ridiculously simple JavaScript API so that when you actually want to use this thing, all you have to know is, hey, I just want to share this image.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, it's a very nice, clean separation between things.
And I think, too, I have a few more things. Because I think the next question that comes up is, well, you showed Flashlight, you showed Social Share. What other things are there out there? And the best place to look right now is on NPM. So if you just go to NPM and you search for NativeScript, you'll find a bunch of results out there. Here's the Flashlight one. Clipboards, tracing logging, WebSockets, emails. There's the Google SDK. There's Social Share. So a bunch of different things out there that you can use. This is the best place to look at the moment. But what's coming up momentarily is we're actually going to be launching a plugin marketplace. It'll be available at plugins.telerik.com, which will sort of be like a curated list of these things, ones that we've personally verified that these things work, these things are well documented, these things are things that are ready for you to use today.
Yeah.
And so you can look for that over probably the next several weeks. We should be launching that.
Yes, that is cool. And it's worked out really well on the Cordova side. So I expect nothing but more greatness.
Yeah, if you're a Cordova person and you're not aware, you should totally check out that URL now because I think we've got like 60 plugins, Cordova plugins up there now. And then the formatting of the NativeScript one will be fairly similar.
Yeah.
So with that, I think that's about all we have today. As always, I'll just point people at both our Google group, which you can also find linked on nativescript.org, and also our Twitter handle, twitter.com/nativescript. Those are sort of the best places to reach out if you have questions about NativeScript, you have questions about anything that you heard today, you ran into issues, feel free to reach out to us at any time. And I think that's it. Clark, do you have any final thoughts you want to add?
No, this is one of those places where, we've done this over the summer. We've done it a few times. You and I have been involved since the beginning, and it's moving fast. So, get active, get involved in some of the news groups that we have. You never know. Like I didn't even know that the WebSockets thing hit NPM. I was looking for that, I don't know, a month ago or so, and it's just bam, there it is.
And yeah, and sort of as a final thing too, I also wanted to thank I think we have 50 groups now in 15 countries that have actually held one of these meetups. Thank you very much. Thanks to those of you who have sent in pictures, sent in feedback. That means a lot to us.
Yeah.
And with that, I think that's all we have. So I'll say thanks one more time.
And have a good summer.
And have an excellent summer.